We come to the point in the lecture today where all the roads of the course have been leading to Cicely Saunders, founder of the contemporary hospice and palliative care movement. And I realize this picture's a bit blurry, but I like it. There's some really bad pictures of Cicely Saunders. I've come to the conclusion that with great people like Cicely Saunders, they're so busy doing things, they're not photographing. And so I've been finding it a challenge. There's, to my knowledge, no good documentaries done on hospice and palliative care. There's very little about her on the internet. So hopefully we're going to correct some of that, and there are certainly new people in the field that are starting to look at her life and work. And certainly one of the most important is David Clark, who has written a biography on Cicely Saunders. He's also written a history of palliative medicine. And he was instrumental in putting all her letters and papers together and getting them put in an archive, which many of us have been able to use now. So this is an ongoing project, but Cicely Saunders remains, I think, not as well known, certainly not as well known as somebody like Florence Nightingale. But I think that is going to change over the years. And so I like this photo because it shows her in action and it shows her smiling. So on the King's College website, where this is the college where she went and where her papers are kept, it says that she is one of the most influential figures of the 20th century with a legacy which continues to affect how many of us will be cared for as we approach the end of life. Is a woman whose name is still relatively obscure, which, as I said, I'm hoping will be corrected over the next 10 years or so. And so it goes on to say that she radically improved clinical care for people at the end of life and paved the way for a more holistic model of person-centered care. So this is material we will be looking particularly at the end of the course, the impact on the overall delivery of care and how it is or isn't working. Now, part of the readings for this week is an analysis of hospices in Denmark and looking at the challenges of trying. The principles may be there, but how do you apply them in a bureaucratic secular system becomes challenging, and I think Saunders knew that. So it ends with one of her quotes saying, "You matter because you are, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can to only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die." And so in some ways, this is the theme of palliative care itself, this idea that every single individual is important and matters, and they deserve to have a peaceful end of life. And also the idea, and I think this is very, very important, emerging out of palliative care, and I think it's a corrective to the way a lot of people view death in our society, which is living right up until the moment of death. That just because somebody has a terminal illness doesn't mean that they can't live fully. And I think Saunders really brought this forward, this idea it can be a time period of reconciliation with people in your life. It can be a time of deep meaning and so on. And certainly it can be a time of spiritual reflection for people. And so when I was trying to put this together, it's very daunting because I have so much admiration for Cicely Saunders, and it's difficult to do justice to her life. It's very full of different turns and twists. So I'm going to just try to highlight what I feel is important for the course, but of course, you need to know there's so much more. And if you are interested in this, there are a number of good biographies on her and more being published all the time that you can read. And her biography is actually very important. I think sometimes with famous people, biographies get overplayed, but in her case, that is almost impossible because every aspect of what becomes palliative care in some way emerges from her own struggles and her own journey in life, as we're going to see. And another very important aspect of this is that a lot of the way that palliative care develops out of relationship, various relationships in her life, and then this goes on to shape it. And so hopefully relationship still sits at the center of palliative care because that's certainly what it emerged from. When looking at the childhood and youth of Cicely Saunders, I think it's interesting to note that she had a pretty miserable childhood and adolescence, and even into her teenage years. And there are a number of reasons for this. But I think it's instructive that her own brother said, comfortable people don't often do extraordinary things. And I read a book on creativity many years ago, and it was saying that they did a full study of creative people in a variety of fields, and there was no one characteristic. It wasn't class, none of these things. But one thing they did find was that these people all had friction in their personalities for some reason. So I think I find that quite convincing, because I think Cicely Saunders from a very young age had this kind of friction in her personality, and that caused her to look outside of herself to look for answers and to struggle in a variety of ways with finding meaning and purpose. And so from her biographies, pretty much everybody agrees her parents had a very unhappy marriage. They eventually divorced, but the home apparently was very unsettled and uncomfortable. There was nothing overt like violence, but it was a very kind of unhappy household. And so there was this sense that Cicely Saunders wanted to escape from this. And certainly her relationship with her mother was never very good or very close. And so we see she bonded with her father, although they also had a very kind of, they argued a lot, which, isn't necessarily a bad thing. But he was a very extroverted, exuberant person, very sociable. He had made a lot of money. He was what is called in England an estate agent. We would call it a real estate agent, but very, very high level, very successful. So he became a wealthy man. So in terms of class, and this is important in terms of the connections that Cicely Saunders is able to make in life. And I think this often gets taken out of the history of certain movements, that this is very important. The other people that the leader of the movement has access to. So through her father, Cicely Saunders gains access to some very powerful people in English society that help her to move her ideas along. But in terms of her childhood and youth, we see she's not close to her mother. She has this kind of conflicted but close relationship with her father. The mother is the opposite, very, very shy, and some of the biographers say she was not accustomed to living in wealth and dealing with servants and so on, so she withdrew a lot. So we see when Cicely Saunders gets to school, she also struggles, and some of it just has to do with physicality. She's a very tall person, and even now in our society, with gender norms being what they are, I think it can be challenging, especially in young life, for girls to be tall and taller than everyone around them. And so she remembers feeling very awkward in herself physically and not feeling like she had a good connection with other people at this early point in her life. And so, as often happens, and another thing that often drives people to into creativity is isolation. So we often see this in the biographies of famous people, that they had illness in their childhood. In this case, we see this social isolation leads her to be this kind of reflective person from quite an early age. Moving along the line of her biography, we see it's important to note again that, like women of, she's upper middle class, like Florence Nightingale, there's a kind of a conflicted attitude towards her education within the family. There's still very much the sense that this is somehow just going to make her more genteel. And so education was not as highlighted, I would say, in her background. And so we're told that she actually failed the entrance into Oxford University the first time she took it. So again, we see she's not having the life of the golden girl here. It's not just flowing beautifully all the time. She's having to always struggle and overcome obstacles. And I think this really shapes her personality. And so she eventually gets into Oxford, and it's pretty clear she probably didn't have the right preparation given her gender. And so we see she goes into Oxford and she's actually studying politics, philosophy, and economics. So at this point, Cicely Saunders is really trying to figure out, like many people in university, what they find interesting, what's meaningful to them, what they want to do with their lives. And so she's studying French and Latin, so a typical classical education. But what intervenes here is the Second World War. So England enters the Second World War in 1939, and hopefully many of you will know that at this point, France fell very quickly to the Nazis, and so basically England, the UK, and Canada, actually, because Canada was part of the Commonwealth, were fighting pretty much alone against this massive force. Eventually, the Americans came on board and things changed in 1941, but as of 1939, the UK was under direct threat of invasion. And so for many young women at this time, being in university was intolerable, this idea that they were studying while other people were going off to fight and die. So at this point, Cicely Saunders leaves university and she begins training as a nurse. And as with Florence Nightingale, there is a sense that her family was not particularly thrilled with this decision. But this is another hallmark of her character, is this desire to be useful and to give to society. This is clearly one of the hallmarks of her character from a young age. And so she wants to contribute to the war effort. And of course, she was one among many women who did this in a variety of ways. There were also women who joined things like the land army, so many men had gone off to fight that there was nobody to, for instance, participate in agriculture and industry. And this was true in North America as well. We see women going into the factories in places like Canada to fill in for the men that have been called up. So she's doing this, and she begins to practice nursing. So clearly she has a war experience, and that's one of the watersheds in her life of practicing nursing during this time. But through it, she realizes that she's not going to be able to continue with nursing because of physical problems. She has back problems throughout her life, and so it becomes clear that nursing is not going to work as a long-term profession. She has back surgery at a certain point, but her doctors tell her that's not feasible, and so she moves on to, so we see these transformations, she moves on to being an almoner. And if you recall way back in the lectures, this idea of almshouses that still exist actually. And so this is a very ancient term coming out of the church. So somebody who takes the tithes and then redistributes them. But by this point, it's basically working as what we would call a social worker. And so she's living in the 1940s at a time when this process is beginning to happen, where these roles that were formerly religious are becoming secularized. And so the role of the almoner is slowly transitioning into what we would now call a social worker. So she becomes a social worker. So we already see by the time she's in her 30s, she's fulfilled these different roles. And this becomes very important in terms of how she then goes on to visualize hospice. So she has actually lived and experienced what it is to be a nurse and a social worker. So those aspects are brought into her vision of the kind of interdisciplinary care that will be, again, one of the hallmarks of palliative and hospice care. Cicely Saunders did eventually finish her degree, and she's finding her feet at this point. You can see from this photograph, she's becoming self-confident. She's becoming much more socially connected to people. And so by 27, she has a much stronger sense of herself. At this time, her parents divorce, and she's worried about the mental health of both of her parents. So we can see throughout her life, a lot of her emotional energy is going into managing this home situation, which is, I think, a common experience of a lot of people. I think it gets left out sometimes of biographies of people. And so I think it's also true that as a woman and as the female in the family, she's playing this role of having to look after her mother, for instance. And so at the same time, she becomes a kind of seeker. And so We know that her family was not very religious at all, according to her brother's remembering of it. The family never went to, hardly ever went to church together. And so they're kind of a culturally Christian family, upper class family. And so we see by her 20s, she's starting to be interested in religion. And so she has a sort of a short period of time where she says she's an atheist, and then she's starting to become interested in religion. And so the first group, so it's important to note that across her life, her religious attitudes change. But she starts out being very drawn to evangelical Christianity. And this form of Christianity, obviously it's a very broad category, but it's definitely Bible focused. It's very much a kind of action in the world. So I think it suited her personality in that sense. Certain other aspects of it over time she becomes less comfortable with, but certainly in the beginning, this is a very good fit for her. She moves, in the course of her life, she moves much more towards kind of Church of England Anglicanism, which she was born into. But Anglicanism has an evangelical stream within it, and it's a more activist stream, which suited her personality. And so she often talks about the idea of love is not enough. You have to take action. So we're told that she begins praying, and she prays for some kind of indication that she's on the right path. And at the age of 27, she has what is referred to as a conversion experience. And so there are a number of these in history, obviously. And so she, according to her biography by de Boulay, she says she was praying to God, and she says, and the Lord, as it were, said to me, it's not you who has to do anything. I have done it all. At that moment, I felt that God had turned me around and that it was all right. It was for all the world like suddenly finding the wind at your back instead of battling against it all the time. And so this period, she's very happy and content and has a sense of purpose. She has the sense there's some life purpose. She hasn't quite found it yet, but she's definitely, as she said, has kind of the wind at her back. And we see this throughout the rest of her life, that even though she's facing these tremendous obstacles, she has this sense that there's a higher power that's helping her and directing her. And the biographer has a really interesting description. De Boulay has a very interesting way of putting it, which is, it's one thing to say you believe in God, but it's like saying you know what electricity is, but it's another to feel it. So she had this kind of overwhelming emotional, spiritual experience. So in this way, there are similarities again to Florence Nightingale, that there's this kind of experience of almost a call to do something in the world that's based in spiritual experience. By age 33, the picture is starting to clarify for Cicely Saunders, and we can see that her biographers make an interesting point that she seemed to have the ability to go forward and also to wait if she wasn't sure. And this is, I think, part of her religious understanding, that sometimes you're waiting to know clearly what the best thing to do next is. And so she, in various capacities, has been working in homes in London that serve people who are chronically ill and dying. So she works at places like St. Luke's, which is had been founded as a place for the poor who are terminally ill, and she had also worked with nursing orders, the nursing orders that I talked about in an earlier lecture, at St. Joseph's, another home for care of the dying. And so she gets a distinct sense that she wants to work with the dying as a result of these direct experiences on these wards. And she's been observing the nuns and how they care for people, and she's very impressed by this, but she sees that there's room for improvement and that this is a very neglected aspect of healthcare. And so a doctor in her sort of social orbit finally says, if you want to work in this area, you need to be a medical doctor because you'll have more ability to change how things are done. And so she goes back to train in medicine at age 33. It's exhausting just thinking about all the things she's already been by this age. So she goes back to study medicine. And so, so de Boulay says, reading medicine is tough at any age. For someone of Cicely's age and with virtually no scientific background, it must have been a nightmare. It was hell, says Cicely, with characteristic bluntness. And so she's having to do basic science like physics that she didn't study before. So she's cramming like crazy to do this. And of course, all the other students are younger than her. But she gets a close social circle around her, a lot of them also religious, and she gets through her training quite easily, eventually when she finds her feet. And so, and we see that her sense of what she wants to do is, as I said, coming into focus. And so, so she notices that while the nuns who work with the dying give this incredible personal attention to people, and she notices things like the nuns have this sense of each person as an individual, and that you have to nurse them as that they're a person, they have their quirks and their characteristics. And so she remembers one of the nuns saying, oh, that's just him being himself. So this idea of respect for each individual is part of the care. But what she does see is that there's a gap in how the pain is being managed. And so that a lot of the new research and the new techniques in pain management have not made their way into care of the dying. And so what becomes her life work is starting to come into focus. And so, at this time, some of you may know this already, there was a concern that you couldn't use opiates because people would become addicted. I've never understood this, that if somebody's in the last days of their life, why that's even an issue. But anyway, this was a concern. There was a sort of obviously stigma around opiates and drugs in general. And so Cicely Saunders kind of decides this is what she's going to research. And again, she has these social connections with high-ranking medical doctors who, as a result, she gets a fellowship to do studies on researching into pain at end of life. And so at this point, she's on the road to her vocation. The next watershed in Cicely Saunders' life is at the very heart of the hospice movement. And certainly when she told the story throughout her life, this was the beginning of the hospice and palliative care movement. And as I said, relationship is again at its center. So it comes about through a relationship she has with a patient. And so in 1947, so the war is over at this point, she is a qualified nurse, a qualified almoner, and a devout evangelical Christian at this point. And while working on the ward, she meets David Tasma, who is a Jewish man, 40 years old, who is alone. He fled Poland during the war, and he's dying alone on a ward with very few contacts in a foreign country. And so, in a sense, this is the foundational problem of end-of-life care. How do you ensure that all people have access to a good death and that they're not alone? And so this brings it all kind of into focus for Cicely Saunders through this relationship. And David Tasma is also wrestling with existential problems that are there for everybody. What was the meaning of his life? What was the purpose of his life? And here he is dying in a foreign country alone. And so Cicely Saunders moves in, seeing this, and it attends to him. And so she's reading the Bible. So she's reading from the Hebrew Bible, as he's Jewish, and talking to him. And at one point she says, should I read to you? And he says, I only want what is in your head and heart. So the idea that he wants her to be present, he wants her to talk with him. And so all of this goes into how Cicely Saunders begins to formulate ideas around end-of-life care. And so she's, talking to him about the meaning and purpose of his life and so on. It is important to note here that I don't want to shy away from this, because obviously every human being has certain aspects of themselves that this can be quite controversial when we look at her life, because first of all, she has this very interesting predilection for Polish people, Polish men. So there's a number of them that are going to be important. And she does get asked about that by one of her biographers. And there's also this almost falling in love with the patient. Now, as a result of researching this, I've come across that there's actually a term for this, which is called the Florence Nightingale effect. So I don't know if any of you are already aware of this, but it's basically the idea that this can happen between a nurse and a patient. And I think I've heard of cases where actually people marry their nurse and so on. So the way I understand it, it's somewhat similar. I know it more from psychology, that idea of transference. So where you're projecting things onto the person. But there's no doubt that she has this it's not physically intimate, but an intimate relationship with David Tasma. And so I don't want to try to whitewash over that, but I think that the closeness of their connection is also what's important about it. So it's kind of got both aspects. So so we're told that in the process of these long talks that they're having, they start to talk about what he would want for a good death, for a proper death. He's Jewish, a proper death. And so he's not very religious, so that's not that important to him. And so they begin to discuss this. And so she starts to talk to him about her plans for the future, of how she could develop this idea. And there's a very famous quote that he says, "Let me be a window in your house." So the idea that when she builds this new institution for end-of-life care, that he will be a window in her house. And so, in fact, when he passes away, he leaves her £500, and this becomes the foundation of the money that goes towards the building of the first contemporary hospice. And this story gets told over and over again by Cicely Saunders. And I think this goes to show that it was foundational to the creation of hospice and palliative care. And Saunders also becomes his executor because he has no family, and she oversees a Jewish funeral for him. And it's interesting to me to see the way in which, or more than interesting, it's kind of startling that part of David Tasma's existential problem was that he felt that he hadn't had meaning and purpose in his life, but in fact, he becomes one of the most important people in the 20th century in terms of changing something. And I think this is a central mystery at the heart of hospice and palliative care, how this person who himself was not sure of the meaning of his own life becomes so important for the well-being of others going forward. By 1959, Cicely Saunders was doing this research into end-of-life pain and pain management, and she's starting to develop this idea that she goes on to call total pain, which I'll have a separate lecture on that concept because it's central to hospice and palliative care. And we're told that she's reading the Daily Light, evangelical Bible readings. And this, from what I can gather, is her main religious practice, along with going to church or chapel, is doing daily readings of the Bible. And so she's reading from Psalm 37, "Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass." And so Duboulay writes, "Suddenly she knew with complete certainty that the years of preparation and waiting were over. At last the time had come when she must do something practical towards realizing the dream that had for so long motivated her life. It was as if the verse was intended especially for her. Quote, somehow these words were the tap on the shoulder to say, now we've got to get up and on with it. It was irrefutable. I couldn't possibly be disobedient to it." So again, this idea of timing, come across it constantly in her biography, that she has periods of activity and then periods of kind of watching and waiting. And so by 1959, moving into the 60s, this is the moment when she's going to start to build what turns out to be St. Christopher's Hospice. So when we look into the documents, we can see this was never a set idea. It was developing as she went. And it's fascinating. I've been in the archives at King's College and looking at the documents and the papers. She's changing all the time. And there's a number of reasons for this. Part of it is how will religion play a role within this hospice? And she starts out thinking that it might be similar to a nursing order, that it's going to be a religious foundation and a religious community, but she very quickly jettisons that idea. And she starts to look at the idea of it being more ecumenical. Now, at this point, ecumenical would mean taking in all the forms of Christianity. Now this changes over time and becomes all forms of religion. And so she fairly rapidly comes to the idea that, as she herself had already noticed working on wards, a lot of people have no religious belief. So it can't be about trying to push your religious belief on people, and that's a very important part, obviously, of how hospice care and palliative care get taken up within the secular sphere, that can't be there. That idea of proselytizing is anathema. And so she's struggling with this. So what will the role of religion be exactly? And so she is reaching out to all sorts of people for advice. And so I came across some of these documents myself. And there were some very frustrating ones where she's using, it's very English, where she's using these weird nicknames for people. And then I'm getting frustrated. And I'm like, who is this person? And then I realized one of the people she's writing to is her brother, Christopher. And so we see that her family and her tight relationships are very, very important in how she builds out her vision. And so Christopher has also become an estate agent, and he's actually instrumental in finding her property to build the hospice. And so I think this can't be emphasized enough, the importance of her own relationships to the vision that she builds. And she's very clear about this, that it was always this group effort. And also the idea, there's the religious idea and also the idea of a community. So even if it isn't a religious order, like we see with the nursing orders, it's at least a very strong community. And so this becomes also very important in hospice, the idea that when you're working in these very challenging, often stressful circumstances, the idea of having a community of other people around you to support you. And so we see this in contemporary hospice, the idea of the team. So the nurses, the doctors, the volunteers, the social workers, everybody, the cleaners, they're all sort of part of a team that support the people working and also the patients. And so this is developing kind of organically as Cicely Saunders is working on what she begins to call the scheme. She calls it the scheme. And so there are many, many letters back and forth with the Bishop of Stepney and these high-ranking church officials, and where she's working out how this is going to work with her vision. And at this point, we see her moving away from evangelical Christianity and towards a kind of mainstream, more Church of England approach. However, when she goes for the first funding for these ideas, it's clear that it can't be on a religious basis. So already there are these forces that are pushing the hospice and palliative care movement more into the secular public sphere. Also during this time in the 1960s, she's starting to travel. And so she's going to the United States and she's going to Canada, and she's lecturing on these ideas of a new concept of end of life. I will be talking more about this, but this is already becoming a topic of conversation in the 1960s because a number of people are questioning attitudes towards death in Western society. And so she's one of a number of very influential people that are looking at this as a problem. And so she goes to Yale University and she gives a talk, which from what I can gather, she's a very influential speaker. And so a lot of people kind of converted to this idea. And she also meets Florence Wald here. And so I'll be having a whole section, a lecture on Florence Wald, who becomes the most important founder of hospice and palliative care in the United States. And so Florence Wald is the Dean of Nursing at Yale. And so we see this, again, this combination of medical doctor and nursing that become a very important part of hospice and palliative care. Also, we see the importance of the relationship between her and Florence Wald. We also see her going to Canada, and she eventually meets Balfour Mount, although he goes to her. He he goes to the hospice that she eventually builds. And so he becomes the most important person in palliative care in Canada. And again, I'll have a whole section on Balfour Mount. But I just wanted to highlight here the importance of these relationships. And from what I can gather, Cicely Saunders is never rigid about this. She's changing and adapting and developing as she's discussing with people and thinking through how this is going to work in actuality. I do want to include more of Cicely Saunders' personal life in this short biography. So de Goulet writes, Cicely sometimes likens her personal life to Hans Andersen's story of the ugly duckling. As the ugly duckling became a swan, so did the plain girl become a handsome, fulfilled woman. As the ugly duckling had to endure a long, cold winter before the spring brought his transformation, so did she. But eventually spring came for Cicely too. In her middle age, not only was she showered by professional honors, tributes, and awards, reaching a climax when she was made a dame in 1980 and awarded the £90,000 Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, but her private life was crowned by meeting the man she was eventually to marry. So it's very clear from her biography, and this would be typical of, still typical, but certainly at that time period, the idea that all women would marry. And so this had always been a source of, I think, a lot of suffering for her. And so it wasn't until she was in her mid-40s that she met, and I'm going to do my best with this pronunciation, Marian Behusisko, who was, again, Polish, a Polish refugee to England. He was an artist. And so according to her biography, not only was it a long wait, it was filled with pain and loneliness. As a girl and as a young woman, Cicely did not relate easily to men. A girl who has ambivalent feelings for her parents seldom has an easy passage in her emotional life, but Cicely had the additional problem of her size. She was not only big physically, she was big in every way. Quote, I seem to spend so much of my life falling over myself because I am too big, she laments. Okay, so in her mid-40s, in 1963, we're told that she was driving and she drove by a public library and she saw a painting in the window. And it was what she describes as a blue crucifixion scene in oil paints. And she went in to look at the exhibit. And according to her biography, she went from picture to picture, entranced, moved, and eager to possess one. So she bought her first painting as a result of this, and she wrote a letter to the artist. So I think you can guess where we're going here. The painter ends up being, they have a long relationship and they eventually marry. Now, this is actually a very complex story and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but he was actually already married. He was a Catholic, so there's no divorcing. And so their relationship, they couldn't be married for many, many years until his wife passed away. Also, it's pretty clear from what I've read that he was a kind of bohemian painter. I don't think he was particularly motivated to get married until later. And so eventually they live together and they get married. And so we see that this comes much later in her life. I got some of the gossip when I was at St. Christopher's and talking to people that Cicely Saunders insisted in putting his paintings all throughout the hospice. And of course, this is very cutting edge, this idea of having art within healthcare settings, and increasingly hospitals are doing that. But some people didn't like the paintings, and so some people were not as thrilled about having the paintings up as she was. But I think it's interesting to see again that her personal life and these religious paintings are also part of her vision of what a hospice will include. As I mentioned, religious belief was at the heart of what was driving Cicely Saunders throughout her life. And she had very close relationships with various religious people in her life that she took advice from. And we can see this in her correspondence. She's writing constantly to people and going to visit them and discuss the ideas. And she goes and visits various religious orders. She goes and talks to various theologians. In this picture, we see her with the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the top-ranking religious official in the Anglican Church. And so, and as I said, she was in constant correspondence with various bishops, important bishops in London. And so I think this sometimes gets kind of ignored within the story, that the fact that she was of the class she had access to high-ranking religious officials, and so these people were able to really help her move her vision forward. And as I talked about in the earlier part of the course, the church, this has been their natural role from the beginning, that they participate in these kind of actions. So she had a lot of support from various wings of the Anglican Church in moving this forward. She also had access to the royal family, who became like patrons of the hospice and so on. So these are all important for making this respectable. So this is at a time when this would have been very strange, and certainly when death denial is kind of the norm. And so to have these very influential people backing her is extremely important and allows her to move her vision forward. So she was always a deeply collaborative thinker. And so at the foundation of the hospice, when she finally buys the piece of land as a charitable trust, and they start building, she's trying to figure out what role religion is going to play. And so one thing she's sure is there will be a chapel within the hospice. And I was pretty shocked, actually, when I was discussing this with somebody. They have removed it at the hospice, and there's this kind of very kind of impersonal room that's replaced it, in my opinion. Certainly, many of you will know that a lot of hospitals, if not all hospitals, have prayer rooms or sacred rooms, whatever they call them. But I do think, and this is something that I'm interested in working on, that this is part of her idea that gets pushed into the background. And that's been my experience, that it's kind of the last thing that people think about. I understand it, because there's so much energy that has to go into fundraising and to taking care of people and so on, that it can move to the background. But certainly from within the worldview of Cicely Saunders, this is absolutely at the center. So when she was working on plans, architectural plans, the chapel was at the center. And also just the name of the hospice, St. Christopher's, so the patron saint of travelers and pilgrims. And so this idea of going back to that very earliest sense of the hospice as a place for pilgrims and travelers. And she also instituted prayers in the morning and the evening. Now, this obviously did not, when we look at how it develops out in different countries, this does not continue. And I don't know if St. Christopher still does that, but in her time period, then all the staff would be having daily prayers. So they would pray for the patients. And so I do want to talk about this later in the course, the idea of we can have cases where doctors and nurses are religious themselves, and so how does that play out in a secular setting? It's always a kind of I think, a tension, but certainly I interviewed a doctor recently who's Muslim. It's at the core of what she's doing, but it's not that she's necessarily praying with her patients. So I'll talk about that a little later when we move further into the course. This is a photograph of St. Christopher's Hospice, the first contemporary hospice in the Western world. And I don't know if you can see, but that statue at the front is St. Christopher that's over the doorway there. And I'm not going to talk a lot because I've realized this is going very long, and I think it deserves its own lecture. I want to talk about the actual building of St. Christopher's Hospice, but just for our purposes in ending this lecture, of course, Dame Cicely Saunders was successful in building this first hospice, and when you look through the biographies and you look through the material, you realize the incredible commitment and energy it took to get something so visionary off the ground. And it's really startling that once this first one gets built, it just effloresces from there. But getting that first one built was the hard part. Afterwards, we start to see them springing up like mushrooms, because clearly it was filling a gap within the culture and within healthcare. And so St. Christopher's is in a suburb of London. It's in a kind of suburban area. And again, I'm going to talk more about architecture and so on a little later in the course. But we see the ways in which the architecture is also bringing to life her vision. And that's why I want to have a separate section looking at architecture, which develops in its own way within the hospice sector. So I'm going to conclude the biography here. As I said, if you're interested, there's some excellent biographies of Dame Cicely Saunders. So what I hope I've made clear is that each relationship, each event within her life directly impacts on the ways in which the hospice, the building of institutions, and the larger palliative care movement evolves over time.